Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. Welcome to episode number 60 now, big 60 of the How to Program with Java podcast. Thank you always so much for joining. And as always, I love to record these things. I love to record these episodes. It's just they take a lot of time because I need to actually post an actual show notes page where I try to be as thorough as possible in terms of really going in depth with all the code that I spoke about and all the topics. And this is really just a long-winded way for me to say I'm sorry for haven't posting an episode in about a month now. I've been really, really busy and overwhelmed with stuff. But here I am. I'm back. Like I said, as always, I'm not leaving you guys. I'm always going to be recording these things. And today we're going to be diving into probably one of the last topics about Hibernate. I think we're finishing up with Hibernate. I really can't think of anything else off the top of my head that I can talk about with respect to Hibernate. So here's what I'm going to do. I think, like I said, this is going to be the last episode on Hibernate. Then I'm going to switch topics, probably over to HTML, JavaScript, that kind of stuff. But if you, one of two things. If you would like me to cover another topic on Hibernate that I have not yet covered, please email me. Okay, you can email me directly at info@howtoprogramwithjava.com. Let me know, say, hey, I'm responding to your comment about, Hibernate topics or whatever. I would love to hear more about, this kind of topic or that kind of topic about Hibernate. So that would be really, really helpful, and or just any topic at all. If you haven't yet seen any topic listed or listened to a topic yet in the podcast, and I haven't published any information about it, then by all means let me know that you want to learn about that, and I will be more than happy to talk about it, so long as it's within my realm of knowledge. Okay, if you ask me to talk about things like JSF, for example, I don't know anything about that, so I really cannot be of help. So if that's the case, I'm going to have to apologize and say I don't know anything about that, and I can't help you out. But I might be able to direct you to a good resource. So anyway, don't hesitate to email me. Again, info@howtoprogramwithjava.com. So let's get the ball rolling with today's episode. Before we jump into the actual meat and potatoes of this episode, I'm going to start off with some 5-star reviews that have come in. Now, I used to use a Mac. So I had a Mac way back when. I purchased one to do some programming with the Objective-C programming language because I wanted to create some iPhone applications. And I did successfully create a couple of iPhone applications, but then I stopped using the Mac. Okay, I had a little Mac Mini. And then I realized that in order to get access to all of the reviews that have come into my podcast, I was only ever looking at the reviews from one country, from Canada, which was what I was looking at inside of my iTunes interface. If any of you guys are podcasters out there, you know what I'm talking about. Probably, I'm guessing the majority of you are not podcasters, so I'll just break it down for you. If you want to look at reviews from all the different countries, then you need to go through a 60-second process to switch between each country. And last I checked, there were a whole lot of countries in the world, and I get reviews from a whole bunch of countries, I think 40, 50 different countries. So in other words, it would take me over an hour to get all the different reviews every time I wanted to record an episode. So someone went out and made a beautiful program to scour the iTunes repository for all the reviews, and they put it into one nice, neat little program that was only available for the Mac. Now, that was fine for me because I had a Mac until recently. I sold that Mac and then realized, oh no, I use that every week to get my reviews, my ratings and reviews. And so lo and behold, I now am in a bit of a tough spot. I've signed up for a service that sends me the reviews weekly now, so I have to pay for that. But they only send the reviews out every Sunday, and currently it is Friday, so I have to wait 2 days before I get all the reviews. In any case, this is another long-winded way of me saying, well, I went into the 3 most popular countries where I receive reviews, which is the US, the UK, and Australia. So those are the 3 top places I get reviews. So I checked all 3 of those, and I found 3 reviews that have come in from the US and the UK. So I'm going to read those. If you sent a review in from any other country, I apologize. I'm not going to get to it this week, but I will be able to get to it on the next episode recording because I will hopefully have received my proper email from that company that I signed up for. Anyway, so having said that, the adventures of Trevor Page. Anyway, the two reviews that came in from the U.S. In no particular order. Our first one came in from of course, I took a screenshot of this review, and it didn't actually get all the review. Now that I'm seeing it in front of my face, I need to click on the More button to see the rest of the review. So while I'm talking about the other reviews, I'm going to be going back into iTunes, logging into the US version, and getting the full version of that one review that I cannot fully read. My apologies. So, very pre-planned and organized show this one is. Not. So the other review that came in, 5-star review from the States, looks like it is from a college student. He says, I'm a college student studying programming, and I found this very useful. Thank you. So there you go. Short, sweet, to the point, 5-star review. I will take anything that I can get in terms of a rating and a review. So thank you so much for submitting that rating review. The title of that review was Great Resource. So I thank you for taking the time to put in your 2 cents as far as what you feel this podcast deserves in terms of a review. Geez, I'm having troubles talking today. Not a good sign. Probably because I'm multitasking trying to find the other review as I'm wasting time talking. So now I've logged into the actual iTunes US store. You can see how much of a pain in the butt this is. Clicking on ratings and review, sorting by most recent. Here we go. Clicking the More button. All right. So here's the other review. Looks like it came in from Fabio Almeida. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, from New York. He says, titled, What a Great Teacher and Programmer You Are. 5-star review. He says, Trevor, I've been programming in Java for a couple of years now, and I still love it. It's like creating something from thin air or pure thought every day. I'm going to take a pause on that review. I love that, for the record. I also share that exact same mindset. And it was actually something that someone had said to me. They said, isn't it incredible how cool programming is? Because you're creating something from pure thought. And I think they didn't even use that word. And I've said that myself. You're taking something that is just a thought in your head and you are making it a reality. It's like art almost. But there's a lot more around it well, I shouldn't say that because I'm not an artist. I just know there's a lot more logic involved in terms of programming. I would think compared to art, but I could be completely wrong. So don't quote me on that. In any case, okay. So we have, let's resume the review here. He says, like creating something from thin air or pure thought every day. Your podcasts are very well organized. Well, clearly this one isn't, but thank you for that lovely vote of confidence. He says, easy to understand and direct and to the point. It is hard to find a person who is a good programmer and a good teacher, and you manage to be both. Again, this is such a great review. I do share that opinion. It is tough to find someone who is also not only a programmer but a good teacher. I didn't really have any great teachers when I was in university. They were all, the nerd types, professors, but none of them were really great at teaching. So anyway, getting on with the review. He says, I listen to your material almost every day. It forces me to stop and think about basics, but also see how others write their code and why. I have shared your website/podcast information in this past week's meeting with my team because I think we can all learn one thing or another from your material, regardless of how long we've been programming. I hope you don't mind. Good luck and keep them coming, Fabio. So absolutely, by all means, anybody can share my material as much as they want with any of their friends because that helps get the word out, and obviously that helps to actually help grow my audience, which I'm obviously a fan of. So if you want to share it with anybody, by all means, you can go ahead and do that. You can even share it via the howtoprogramwithjava.com/love link, LOVE. Show us how much you love the show by sharing it with that little shortcut, what you call it, URL, with all your friends and family. They will be directed to my How to Program with Java iTunes, page, you can call it, and they can subscribe to it and leave a rating and review. So that's pretty cool. All right, so now we can flip over to the UK. This was actually a 4-star review. Usually I only read 5-star reviews, but I just wanted to address something that he said. I believe it's a he inside of the actual review that he left. He said, this podcast is great, but the episodes are all messed up. The first is in the line is episode 46, and the last is episode 10. I managed to find them all, but it would help a lot if you wrote episode 1, Java Hello World. So he's mentioning the actual titles that I use for my episodes. And he says, thanks in advance, blah, 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 his name. So I think it's Aliquid Hacker is his username. So just to address the first issue, which is they're all messed up, I don't have control over that, actually. That is something that iTunes does. They show it as most recent episodes first. So that's what you see. You see the most recent episode first. Why it's showing episode 46 first is actually a mystery to me, and why the last one is episode 10 is also a mystery to me. So when I go into the actual podcast itself, like if I go into my details and take a look at the most recent episode, it is correct for me. So I'm not sure why it's not showing up correctly for them. Who knows? I would suggest using a different program on your computer. If you're using iTunes on your computer, maybe switch over to your mobile phone and get a podcasting app for your mobile phone. Who knows? Okay. Or if you're already on your mobile phone, maybe try another different podcasting app. For example, I use the app called Downcast. Okay, you need to pay for it, but I cannot see anything wrong with this program. It does everything I need it to do in terms of managing my podcast libraries, making it easy to get and delete episodes in bulk. Just a great app, Downcast. I would strongly recommend that one. Otherwise, you can always get the built-in podcasting app on your iPhone if you have one. If not, then I'm not sure what else you want to look up. But anyways, Downcast is great. So that's to address the stuff that's all messed up. And then he says he managed to find them all, but it would help if I were to write something else in the title of the show. Now, that's not a bad idea, but the reason why I don't do that is because that takes up more character space, and I really need to make the best use of the number of characters that I can in each of my titles. Perhaps what I could do is put in an abbreviated version of that. So instead of saying episode 1, I can put EP1 or something like that. In any case, that's something that I can definitely look into to see if I can go back and change all the different show titles. Okay. But if you want to find all the episodes and you're having difficulty, you can always go to the blog. Okay, go to howtoprogramwithjava.com. There is a link. When you go to the actual blog, there's a link at the very top, a little sort of tab where you can click on podcasts. Okay, when you click on that, you will get a little program that'll pop up on your website, browser, and you'll be able to go through each and every single one of my shows. And they should be organized nicely, and there shouldn't be any tomfoolery going on, if you will. All right? So again, go to the blog and click on the podcasts tab once you're actually reading the blog itself. All right? Whew. So now that I'm done with all those formalities and getting all that out of the way, how many minutes am I? I'm already almost 15 minutes into this show, but that's okay because I think this episode should not take very long. Okay, because we're wrapping things up. So the topic, let's dive into the good stuff now. So the topic that I want to talk to you about is regards to grouping data. So you should all be familiar with grouping data already, as well as aggregate functions. If you're not, I can give you a quick overview, but there's definitely a podcast episode that I recorded in the past that goes over this exact stuff. It's entitled SQL Group By, okay, SQL Group By, as well as SQL Aggregate Functions. Okay, two different podcasts released on June 16th and June 5th, 2014, respectively. Okay, so if you need to find those, you can go back and find them there. So, but to give a brief overview of aggregate functions and of the group by, aggregate functions are used in tandem with grouping data. So grouping data is all about, let's say you have a bunch of transactions, which is going to be the example we're using today. Let's say you have a whole bunch of transactions and they belong to different bank accounts, right? So let's say you have, 4 different bank accounts. You have, a checking account, a savings account, a line of credit, and maybe like some sort of long-term, like a RRSP. Sorry, that's Canadian. Some sort of retirement type savings account. Who knows? Whatever. So you have 4 different accounts, and you make transactions in those accounts every day. Sometimes you make debits, which is you purchase something. Let's say you purchase a lunch on your debit account. Let's say you need to make a big purchase, but you can't afford it, so you put it on your line of credit, like a television or something like that. And then you get a paycheck, let's say, into your savings account. So that's a credit, not a debit type of transaction. So there's a whole bunch of transactions that you've made across a whole bunch of different bank accounts. Now, you want to be able to group together that data. This is actually useful from a company perspective. So from the perspective of, let's say, the bank and the bank's software application, they want to be able to provide you with a report, okay, about your transactions. Okay, so they want you to be able to see your transactions, and they want them to be organized in terms of which account, which transactions belong to which accounts. So which makes sense to you, because if you were to click on, let's say I go into my bank account, I log in, I click on my checking account, I want to be able to see all the transactions that I made from that checking account. I don't want to see any transactions that are from my savings account or my my retirement account or my line of credit. I just want to see the transactions that I made from that checking account. So that's where grouping comes into play. You can group data together based on some sort of field, some sort of metric, okay? And that metric or that field is going to be by a grouping by the bank account ID. Does that make sense? So you group the data sort of into buckets. That's how I use it, how I visualize it. Each bank account would be a bucket where I could place transactions into. All right, and that's what SQL does in the background. At least the database management system does it for you. So that's how you group data together. You use the group by command. Now, the aggregate functions are performed on top of the data that has already been grouped. So if you look at your buckets, so you've got a bucket that is your, let's say, your checking account bucket, which holds all of the transactions that you had made for your checking account. Okay, like I said, you purchased lunch. Let's say you purchased all your meals there, and maybe you get your paycheck there as well, let's say. So a bunch of debits and credits in there. You've got all that data grouped together, but now you want to do an aggregate function. Like, let's say you want to sum up all of that data so you can have sort of an idea of your cash flow for that one account. All right, you can do that. You can perform a sum on that particular bucket because that's called an aggregate function. Each function, you can do a sum, you can do a min, a max, an average, all these kinds of different mathematical things that you can do to your data that has been grouped together. So this is completely, you're probably very much aware of this. Like I said, if you're not, there's 2 episodes that I've recorded in the past in June 2014 that will help you with that information. But you probably are already familiar with this. So obviously, why am I talking about it again? Well, I'm talking about it in terms of Hibernate. How do you get Hibernate to carry out these group by functions, and how do you use the data that you get back from Hibernate? Now, you would think that this should be a relatively easy process, but it actually is a little bit tricky because I went through yesterday and tried to do this myself, and I had to keep going back and looking at all of the documentation online because it's just not something I do a lot, so it's not something that I've really committed to memory yet. So, the first thing I can say is that inside of Hibernate, when you're doing grouping of data, it's not called grouping. They don't use the term group by. Okay? I'm not exactly sure why they don't use that term. I can only assume, again, this is an assumption, I assume that in all of the other platforms for all the other different relational database management systems, so in other words, not just MySQL, but maybe SQL Server, Oracle, DB2, so on and so forth, maybe they don't all use the term group by in their sort of syntax. Again, I have no idea why, if that's true or not. Let's just assume that is the case, so that's why they chose not to name it group by. Instead, they refer to it as a projection. Okay, so we're not grouping data, we're using a projection. So projections occur, you use them when you're grouping data, which means you use them while you are creating your queries. And your queries should be, if you design your system correctly, should be happening inside of your DAO classes, your data access object classes, all right? So within your DAO class, you are going to be creating your query. Now, I am going to be talking about these projections, this grouping functionality, with respect to the create criteria function or create criteria method, if you will. So the create criteria is something that you can use to obviously create a SQL query without having to know any actual SQL stuff. You don't have to know the structured query language at all. Okay, you just need to use their own, I guess you can call it syntax, for building your query, and that's essentially what it is. It's a way to build a query step by step. Okay, so what I do is, inside of my DAO, let's say I've created a method. I've created a method called get transactions by, let's see, I guess it'd be by account or account ID, right? Because you want to get the transactions and group them by account. So let's create that method, get transactions by account. And within it, I need to do the standard sort of almost boilerplate stuff where we get the session from, whatever it is that we're getting it from. In the more recent versions of Hibernate, I think you use an entity manager. In older versions, you use a session factory, or vice versa. I believe you can use either one. There's no real big difference in terms of how it relates to the actual applications you're going to be building. Unless you really get into really, really large applications where millions of people are going to be using it, then there's probably a whole bunch of subtleties between the two, entity manager versus session factory. I've been talking about session factory this entire time, but I thought I would drop in that you can also use something called the entity manager to get the session from. In any case, I don't want to confuse you guys. I just want you guys to know that there's a different way to get the session and work with the session. All right. So you could use either. And then what you do from the session is you do session.createCriteria. So you create your criteria, which is the starting point of your query. So I'm going to say session.createCriteria, and I'm going to put in essentially the table that we're going to be selecting from, and that's going to be the transactions table, right? Because we're looking at transactions and we're looking at grouping these transactions by their account IDs. So I'm going to type in transactions.class. Okay, because it's object-oriented right now. We're using the object that represents the table. So in this particular program that I've sort of thrown together really quickly, I'm using the transactions class that I've created that is essentially the template, what's called the entity for my transactions table. And then if I leave that alone, hopefully you guys remember, if I just don't do anything else, then that is essentially going to build the query, a select star from transactions query. Okay, that's just going to give me all the transactions. So that's not enough. I want to do more. I want to group the transactions by their account IDs. So how do I do that? Well, I keep going with this session.createCriteria statement. Okay, I do something called chaining. I chain another method call onto my create criteria class, which is nice because I don't have to keep on fiddling with it. I can just keep on saying dot this, dot that, dot this, dot that, and that's method chaining, which is really, like I said, very handy. So saves a lot of time and typing. So I can say create criteria transactions.class, and then I can say dot set projection. Okay, so that sort of allows me to start, defining what my projections are, and then I can do a few things. All right, if I want to just group by my actual account IDs, at least let me double check this because I didn't do it this way that I'm actually saying right now. So let me just make sure that what I'm about to say is correct because I would have egg on my face otherwise. So I'm going to say dot set projection. And then I'm going to say projections as a static reference. So capital P, projections, dot, group property. Okay? So the group property is the sort of static call that I use, method call, to start up this whole process of grouping this stuff together. Okay, so all right, I say projections.groupProperty, and then I specify the name of the column that I'm going to be grouping on as it pertains to my transactions class. So as it pertains to the actual object class itself. So in that case, it would be account ID, spelled out in camel case, account, all lowercase, then ID, the I is capital, right? And all right, so now I'm typing this in right now, and I'm getting errors, but that's probably because I have the wrong, whatchamacallits, variable names and all that stuff. Let me just pause this recording just so I don't, mumble on and waste all your time. Let me just pause this, and I will get right back to you through the beauty of technology with the correct answer. And lo and behold, beauty of technology, I now know the answer. So everything I was saying was absolutely correct. No problemo. You can absolutely do it this way. So again, what I'm trying to build here is a query that does select star from transactions and group by account ID. All right. So we are able to say .set projection, and then within the brackets of this method, we use the projections.group property static call. Okay, it's a static call to a method, and group property is sort of the term that they use to use the group by method, which is nice, right? So it has the word group in it. There you go. So it almost makes perfect sense. So it has group property, and then you like I said, specify the name of the actual property that exists within the object that you are selecting on, which in this case is transactions. So I want to say group property, and then in the quotes, I want to say account ID in camel case, as I already mentioned. Now, the part that I got confused on was you can actually assign an alias to this. And this is useful because it's going to become useful in a little bit when I get onto the more advanced stuff with projections. But I want to mention it now. You can assign an alias to it, which means you can assign your own word for it, your own. It's almost like a variable name for that particular. It's a field name for that particular command that you're actually carrying out, that grouping that you're carrying out. So you're grouping by version, but you can group it by version and say as, and then give it a name. So you can actually type in, after the group property has been set, you can say .as, so you're chaining again, and then you can actually give it in as a string the name that you want to give it. So in this case, account ID is our name, but you could just call it ID if you really want to. You could say .as ID. Completely up to you. Again, it doesn't really matter too much with the group property. What it does matter with is later on when we get into other things, like when we want to count the actual, we'll return the count on the as an aggregate function. All right. So just a side note. So then, okay, you've set your projection, beautiful, and then at the end of your last bracket, you can say .list. So what that will do is it'll return a list of the results. So this result list should be, if I'm not mistaken, it should just show the actual account ID. So that's all it's going to return. It's just an account ID, because that's the only thing that you've selected in terms of inside of your select statement. You're essentially grouping by account ID, and that's what you're selecting because you have specified it inside of your actual statement, inside of your projections. That's what you're going to end up selecting, is what you put into your projections. Now, because we are selecting account ID, this is actually going to cause a bit of a problem, because what happens is we're going to say .list, which means return me, like I said, the list of all of this stuff, essentially the results of this statement. But all it's going to be returning is that one column. It's just going to be returning account ID. But we don't have any object right now that is associated with just an account ID. I mean, we have a transactions object, which has a bunch of stuff. I should probably let you know what it actually has inside of it. The transaction class keeps track of, obviously, the primary key, which is ID. It keeps track of the amount of the transactions, the transaction type. So right here, it's going to be, a credit or a debit or what have you. It's keeping track of the date that the transaction actually happened on, and it's keeping track of, obviously, the account ID for this particular transaction. All right. So, but that's got, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5 different columns that it has. But what we're selecting from, because we are doing a group by, is we are just getting one column. So there's a dilemma. How do we map this to something? Right now, what we can do is we could just let it return it as an object, but that actually gets a little bit tricky as you add more fields that you want to select from. Because if you're just dealing with a plain old object, I was having a heck of a time trying to figure out the syntax for extracting information from it. So instead of really wasting all your time with that and writing a whole bunch of crazy custom code and essentially reinventing the wheel, what you can do is you can make use of something called a result transformer. Now, we've seen this before when we were setting a distinct root entity. I believe it was in the last episode when we wanted to get rid of duplicate entries when you're returning a list of entries, okay? What we can do here is we can use a set result transformer code again, but this time, instead of obviously setting the distinct root entity, we're going to be using a transformer that uses something called alias to bean. So what in the heck does that mean? So what we can do is, I'll tell you what the code is, and then I'll tell you how we can actually make use of it. So we can actually say transformers, which is awesome. I'd love to be able to type in transformers into programming code. That's cool. Capital T. You say transformers dot alias to bean. So again, it's a static method call to this code that will actually map out what the result is from your particular query. In this case, it's just one column, the account ID, and it takes that and it maps it to a bean class, which means it's just an object that has a bunch of instance variables with getters and setters. Okay, we've seen this a million bazillion times. It's just an object with getters and setters. So we can create our own bean class. We can create our own class that will represent our returned columns. In this case, it's just the account ID. So we can actually create an object that just has an account ID in it. And that's what we can use and plug into this transformers.alias-to-bean command. Okay. In our case, the one that I've done here is I've called it grouped transactions DTO. So DTO stands for data transfer object, and that's really the purpose of it, is just to take the data that comes back from our select statement and just transfer it into an actual object itself, so we can use it easily in some way, shape, or form. All right, that's what a DTO is all about. There are definitely other uses for a DTO, but this is just what I'm using it for in this case. Usually I think it's used for, web services and that kind of thing, but I'm just going to use it here because I couldn't think of a better name. So I'm using something called a grouped transactions DTO class, and when you go into this class, this object, all it is just a class. It has one instance variable declared, which is private integer account ID, and then it has a getter and a setter for that account ID, and that's it. It's like, 15 line, well, not really 15 lines of code, but really it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code to be able to take care of all that stuff for us. So very small class, but we plug it in here nonetheless. We refer to the actual class itself. So we say grouped transactions DTO.class, and then we perform our dot list. So now what Hibernate will do is it will actually create the query. So it'll create the select star from transactions group by account ID. It will then take that result from that transaction or that query and map it into our bean class that we just created, the group transactions DTO bean, and return a list of those objects. Okay, so we're going to have a list, a bunch of those objects. We're going to have as many of those objects as we have unique entries for account IDs inside of our select statement. Okay. And then from there, we're just using a plain old Java object with some data in it, and we can do whatever the heck we want with it. Okay, so you see how that got a little bit confusing there with the result transformer and using the transformers dot alias to bean. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of code there that I just said. Your head's spinning. So obviously, as always, you can go to the aforementioned show notes link, which was howtoprogramwithjava.com/session60. And you'll be able to see exactly what the heck I'm talking about in terms of the code that I created for this particular application. Okay. So beautiful. So now we know how to get grouped data. Fantastic. But what if we want to actually use some aggregate functions along with our grouped data? How do we do that? Well, then we turn to a slight modification on our existing code. So now let's go back to the code itself. So we have, let me just do some commenting, some switching around on my own screen here. What we can do is we can do the same thing. We do a session.createCriteria. Okay, we're still going to be creating a query, and we're still going to be querying the transactions class, so transactions.class, which obviously maps to the transactions table. And we're still going to be doing a dot set projection because we're still using these things called projections, which include the group property, which we were talking about before, to group the data together. But instead, we can't type in projections.group property and then do a comma or something like that, and then say projections dot and do another sort of projection, which in this case, let's say I want to actually have a count. I want to count the number of transactions that have occurred within a particular account ID. So I want to know how many transactions occur in an account ID. So this could be useful if you're a bank in terms of charging customers. So if they are on a particular plan and they're only allowed to have so many transactions per account before they get charged an additional fee or something like that, that's where something like this would come in handy, all right? I don't know how your banks work where you live, but that's almost how our banks work. For ours, I think it's for all of your accounts. If you go over a certain number of transactions for all of your accounts combined, then you get charged an extra fee, which is really annoying, but that's just how it works here in Canada. So it's almost perfect, but in any case, almost perfect in terms of how it maps to this particular scenario, that is. It's obviously not a perfect system because I don't want to have to pay for all the transactions that I'm actually making in any case. So we do the dot set projection, but here's the curveball. So we want to have two different quote-unquote projections. We want to be able to do a group property, and we want to be able to get a row count. So what we do is we need to do or specify projections dot projection list. Okay, so this is kind of like, to me, it seems like a hack. It seems like a workaround for being able to put this in here. But in any case, you make a static method call to the projections dot projection list method. And then you can chain on that. You can say dot add, and you add a projection. Then you can say dot add and add another projection, dot add, and add another projection, and another, as many as you like. You can just keep on chaining them on as to your heart's content, I suppose. So for this, projections dot projection list dot add, and then I can start adding my projections. So now I just add them as I was doing them before, which is projections.group property. And then I type in, account ID or whatever. Now here, if you want to, you can actually make use of a different syntax for assigning an alias. So when you're doing a projection list.add, to assign an alias, you type in your projections.group property. You type in your account ID. And then instead of saying dot as, what you can do is you can just put a comma. You put comma, and then you type in the actual alias for your property. In this case, obviously, we don't need one because I would just use the same name. Where I do want to use something different is when I put another projection in there. I'm going to say, close my bracket and say dot add, and I'm going to do projections.row count. So a projections.row count will actually execute a count, but it's going to store the count as a strange name, and I forget what it is that it stores it as. So instead of trying to guess what it will store it as, I'm going to assign an alias. So I'm going to say projections.row count, and then I'm going to say comma, and then I'm going to just put in whatever alias I want. In this case, I'm just going to type in count to be very non-creative. But now I've assigned an alias that I know and I understand and I can remember, and that comes in handy when we are then going forward and using our result transformer, our dot set result transformer, and doing our transformers dot alias to bean static method call. All right, when we make a call to that, we are going to be putting in our grouped transactions DTO, our data transfer object, and now inside of that, we're going to modify it to include another instance variable, which in this case is going to be a private long count. Okay, and I'm calling it count, and I'm assigning a getter and setter for that count variable because I call it count because that's what the alias is. If I'd named the alias something different, I would have to name my instance variable inside of my grouped transactions DTO class something different to match that alias. So again, I couldn't remember what it was that the database assigned to that count aggregate function, so I'm just going to assign my own alias. That way I know what to map it as inside of my DTO object. Okay, or rather just DTO, because O stands for object, and I don't want to call it data transfer object. Anyway, that's just me being ridiculous and nitpicky. So then you can say, okay, you finish up your whole, criteria statement here by saying dot list, and then you can return a list of grouped transaction DTO objects and use it again to your heart's content. So there you have it. That is essentially what you can do with grouping data and making use of the aggregate functions. It's all inside of the projections. I suppose you'd call it static class, I suppose you can call it, and it's all about using if you want to use multiple ones, and you use projections.projection list, and you can say .add, and you can say projections . And if I go through the different ones we can do an AVG for average. We can do a group property, which we already talked about. You can do a max, a min. You can do a bunch of other things, a sum, and a bunch of other things that I'm not exactly sure what they're used for. I didn't look at them. So like count distinct is an option as well. I'm not sure what that does. You can do an ID. I'm not sure what that is for. Or just a regular old property. Again, I'm not exactly sure what all those are for, but I'm sure there are examples all over the interwebs on how you can make use of those different variations of projections. But I figured I just wanted to teach you the ones that you're already familiar with, which is the max, min, average, count, and grouping in general. And that's how you make use of it all. And that's the beauty of Hibernate. Once you know it once, hopefully you can copy paste again and make your lives a whole lot easier in the future. So there you go. I spent a lot of time trying to track down exactly how to implement this code yesterday. Got a little bit frustrating, but eventually I hashed it out, and I'm very happy to be able to pass that on to you today. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. I kept it under 45 minutes, so that's good. I promised you, at least I tried to promise, that it would be short, and this is more or less a short episode as it compares to all the other ones, so that's wonderful. But finally, to finish things up, to wrap things up, I want to point you to howtoprogramwithjava.com, my blog, because recently I did a sort of a small facelift on it. I created a new landing page for that actual blog itself. So when you go to howtoprogramwithjava.com, you're going to see something new. And what is new about it is, well, maybe I'll leave it up to you as a surprise. Maybe you can go to howtoprogramwithjava.com, check out the new little landing page that I've created, because I like it. It's quite simplistic. It's quite minimalistic, and I want to hear what you guys think about it, because I think it's cool. And it obviously has some great information on how to get access to the tips to becoming a Java pro. So check that out yourself, and then you can always click through and say read the blog to go onto the actual show notes page, which is howtoprogramwithjava.com/session60, as this is episode number 60. So thank you for listening. Always a pleasure to record these things and to pass on this very valuable knowledge to you. And now is back to me for the very difficult task of deciding what topics to jump into next and how best to teach it to you. So like I said at the beginning of this episode, if you want to know anything else about Hibernate, please by all means email me directly at info@howtoprogramwithjava.com and let me know what other topics you'd like to learn about, and I will see where I can slap them in to my tutorial series that I have been doing here with the podcast. So take care of yourselves, guys. Have a very happy weekend if you're listening to this on the Friday that's being recorded and released. Otherwise, have yourself a very good week, and I will see you in the next episode. So take care of yourselves, happy learning, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.